We have a paradox on our hands. Apparently, there are no blueprints, no mathematical or engineering calculations, or even plans in regards to the exposition structures or grounds. What a curious paradox. Let's begin. That will come later, though. First, a more pressing story has arisen from this investigation, and there's a question that must be asked, not necessarily regarding blueprints per se. It is if the main historical account was stretched, exaggerated, or even completely fabricated, done deliberately to sell a grand story of achievement and progress. A truly American success, a story that you most certainly would not expect, a tale not heard anywhere else, one that has always been there and merely requires a narrator. It begins here. Who was responsible for developing the grounds of the Columbian Exposition? Daniel Burnham was considered the overseer of this entire exposition project. Yet the one assigned to the grounds, specifically, was Frederick Olmsted. He was an American landscape architect, some would consider the first of his kind, an original in the field, having knowledge of topographic engineering, and completing many notable projects, laying out extensive parks and parkways within the United States, charged here with creating a scene from soil, with impression and intention. Now, spoiler alert, I found some archival data on Mr. Olmsted, courtesy of the United States Department of the Interior, National Park Service, and Frederick Olmsted National Historic Site. This archive consisting of roughly 215,000 images of plans, maps, sketches, and blueprints of various projects completed by Olmsted and Company. Just a few, eh? Links are in the description should you feel obliged to explore yourself. And let's just read a brief section here in a publication called Frederick Olmsted, Landscape Architect. It was completed in 1922, which is a biography completed by his son of the same name. The richness and variety of the professional papers left by Frederick Olmsted, Sr. is astonishing, especially in view of the enormous amount of work on the ground which he accomplished in the almost 40 years of his active career as a landscape architect. Orderly and thorough by habit of thought, he wrote down with minute care the various steps of his professional dealings, in many cases retaining unused drafts, which show valuable processes of mind. We will get to more of these later in the presentation, and may reference this book later as well. There were two plans that piqued my curiosity and are the catalysts of this entire episode. The first here, which is a plan showing the arrangement of the terrace east of the manufacturer's building. Now notice here we have this curved section that says paved beach. This continues on until the music hall on the right here. If we look on the left side here, we can see there is a diversion or difference between the paved beach and the actual layout of a road leading to the pavilions right in front of the manufacturer's building, just here. Now take note of these details as we will look through a few images to dissect this further. Here we have the second plan, this one coming from the opposite direction. The manufacturer's building on the top, while the curved section, or what appears to be the beach, is south or down below. On the right, we have an indication of this top pathway leading to the pavilions, labeled Macadamized Road. Unsure if I'm saying that correctly. However, this is just a type of paved road. Basically, crushed stone is placed in shallow layers and then compacted, and it usually has some sort of binder, and it could be asphalt or even cements. We also have this curved section labeled as stone pavement, while it is bordered by another, thinner element labeled stone flagging. So, Over to some imagery. From the Ryerson and Burnham archives, we have this image from further north, showcasing the bricked shoreline and what appears to be the stone flagging. Another more bird's eye shot here shows the front of the manufacturer's building, and the very section that was presented in the plans. This again is the bricked shoreline. Moving over to the publication Dedicatory and Opening Ceremonies of the World's Columbian Exposition, we have an image that shows this road, indicated on both plans along with the stone flagging and the bricked shoreline, or as it was labeled, the paved beach. I'll leave that up for you to decide if I'm correctly labeling these in agreement with the plans and images. One aspect that was still curious is that the flagging and road leading to the pavilions look much newer than this bricked shoreline. Venturing back into the original written plans from Campbell's Illustrated History, and just found this minor section here. It reads, "At their own expense, the South Park Commissioners will pave the beach along the entire shore of the lake." Now, this is still quite vague, and this could mean the road that was paved, or even the flagstone walkway. The bricked shoreline would appear more refined if it was specifically built for this exposition, would it not? Therefore, maybe it was older. Was this part of something pre-existing? There were also some interesting images that had caught my attention in regards to these bricked areas. I showed some aspects of these and put forward the idea that large sections of the entrance were completed with more durable materials, like brick, showing some images from Charles Arnold's albums, and even this particular one showing what looks like a few lads here either laying or taking up this bricked area near the peristyle or just next to the main basin area. Yet there were more that may add to this interesting aspect. Images surrounding the peristyle that do seem to indicate this large bricked area. Even this image taken during the winter showing what looks like piles of bricks. Unsure if this is afterwards or before the event, yet we do not have this chocolate pavilion in the frame, which would most likely indicate a construction image leading up to the event. This here is the chocolate pavilion I'm talking about, which is intriguing because looking at the surrounding ground areas, this whole space seems to be completely brick. And looking closely here, are some areas more worn and damaged? Does this look to be a fresh batch, recently laid? I'll leave that one for you to decide. We have images like this side profile of the Statue of the Republic, where it appears like this brickwork may have even come right up to this terrace. This may be pushing it and is only based on imagery though. Yet another image may add to this unusual case of bricked areas, with the manufacturer's building entrance. We have here what looks like a series of piled bricks or blocks. Are these being pulled up to use later, or prepared to be laid down before the exposition? This was a bit puzzling, and even though the general plans did indicate some areas would use more durable materials, having imagery that relays it is another facet to consider with the construction process. However, let's look at a couple more here. This one is labeled as lower section of west entrance and vestibule, manufacturer's building. We can see again that the entrance is completely bricked. However, something caught my eye, and being quite familiar with this event now, to a certain extent, I noticed this building in the right of the frame. This is the transportation building. Looking from the west of the manufacturer's building, you would have basically an uninterrupted view of the transportation building unless you were more south, and the electrical building would be blocking your view. However, this picture is taken with the entrance facing north, and the transportation building facing the camera. So this, folks, is why it's important to question the details. These are from an archival website for Chicago, so the information regarding this image is not only mislabeling the entrance direction, but has mislabeled the building. This is not the manufacturer's building. This is the mine's building. Looking at this next image from the second floor of the same vestibule, it is again labeled the same, just using upper floor. Yet in the distance we can see this bridge here. It is in between the mines and electrical building, leading to the wooded aisle, and ironically we see a portion of the manufacturer's building in this image in the distance. You can also see the indication of the bricked floor below, faintly. So this indicates that multiple large buildings may have had bricked entrances. Also a substantial crack in this material up here. Just a note. Anyways, I doubt this was done intentionally, yet it is an example of how historical data can be manipulated throughout time. Just a reminder to be diligent and cross-reference if possible. These images did drum up some intrigue, and so back into the archives we go, back to the shoreline. Very curious as to whether these areas may have earlier histories than the exposition dates. Let's take a look at the next plan here, again from Olmsted's archives. This one showing the topography of Jackson Park with contours, clearly before the event. We will cross-reference this later on and explore some of these plans or blueprints. So as we scroll through this briefly here, we can see that the entire area is gridded out, with some light sketch marks for potential building locations, along with workings of canal routes. Quite detailed, and every square contains elevation data, in preparation for the event. The main detail here is our shoreline, and as we can see, there is a northern section that is clearly mapped out as being bricked, and the section we have been looking at is also clearly illustrated with a brick pattern. So from this data, which was intriguing at least to me, this shoreline was indeed there before the event. Yet there are also some other features on this map that were somewhat surprising. We can see pathways, bridges, and buildings, even these pier-like structures, one which will be used for the naval exhibit, and the other will be fashioned into the main pier leading into the peristyle. Back to the park though. This was not just a barren stretch of land. This appeared organized, laid out in a particular fashion. Now my curiosity was truly gripped. From here was a search for maps of Chicago before the Columbian Exposition. Not only that, but ones that included this area known as Jackson Park, which was several kilometers away from the central hub. Many earlier maps did not include this area, simply because the city had not expanded that far. From what I would assume, that is, anyways. There were a few, though, that contained a glimpse into this area. The first here is from 1872, a map of Chicago and surrounding areas. As we head south, we see Jackson Park. However, it isn't named Jackson Park. These two sections, which were the location of the entire Columbian Expo, including the Midway and into Washington Park, were known at this time as South Parks. They were indeed there, and they were labeled parks. Unfortunately, this was the earliest one I could find, and there are a few later ones, so let's take a quick look at those here. This one from 1877, known as Esquivel's Map of Chicago. Again, we can see the top section of the parks, labeled as such, showing the paths and waterways. 10 years later, we have another map showing these areas. They have now been labeled accordingly, as previously mentioned. And just look at how this space is utilized, with greenery and water. Even from this crude map, it appears manicured. Also notice how the rail line goes directly through the Midway. This then leads directly to the downtown core of Chicago. Pointing this out to keep in mind as the logistical lines were in place long before this event, and were then modified to direct a mass amount of lines towards the expo. Here's a quick map showing the depots and train lines to illustrate this further, this being from 1889. Next we have a map from 1888. It is known as the Cram Map of Chicago, and it depicts these parks also. One more here from 1889 of Chicago and its environs, and again showing these parks with the details shown in the initial plans from Olmsted. So the South Park Commission was the body that was in contact with the exposition representatives in regards to the grounds, yet I was curious about these parks and wanted to find out their origin. Strangely enough, I came across this publication. Chicago South Park Commission Report Accompanying Plan for Laying Out the South Park, completed by none other than Frederick Law Olmsted and fellow landscape architect Calvert Vaux. Now we have a story. So the grounds that were prepared for the Columbian Exposition were not only completed by Olmsted, but he was part of the original layout and design of the South Parks initially, roughly 2 decades prior. There was even this map showcased on the Hyde Park Historical Society, which indicated the area before it was landscaped and turned into South Parks, which were eventually used for the exposition. I'll link the page. Feel free to read up on it yourself. After this was the uncovering of the original plan presented for this series of parks, the entire South Park complex being linked by what would later be called the Midway Plaisance. And just look at this thing. This plan is dated to 1871, and this would then reinforce why I could not find this area before 1872 on other maps from before that time period. Even showing structured or built out areas for where the peristyle and manufacturers building would be, along with an area called the Lagoon Concourse, which shows an area with a repeating like pattern, and concourse just being a large open space for the gathering or passage of crowds, a thoroughfare, if you will. We can see this is the same pattern used on various walkways around the park, even streets, and this space for a games area within Washington Park. The shoreline does not have this pattern though, so maybe this doesn't mean a material. So are these structures or areas in these plans related to the large bricked areas that were in the previous imagery? Could they have already been there from a younger Olmsted? I'll leave that one for you to decide. Now we have something truly intriguing to consider. Let's go back into some documents, and I would even hazard a guess that you know these details offhand because they are the history we have been told. One could call it mainstream, even. In Campbell's Illustrated History, this location is compared to a swamp. Daniel Burnham's description of this area of land as a swampy, sandy flat, liable at times to be submerged by the lake, which comes from the Book of the Builders. From a publication called John Wellborn Root, a study of his life and work, we have the following quote: Jackson Park, then a forlorn waste of sand and bogs, just redeemed from long litigation, was offered by the South Park Commissioners. Another instance from the pictorial history of the Columbian Exposition. For the whole tract had been originally, as 2/3 of it still remained, a treacherous morass, liable to frequent overflow, traversed by low ridges of sand, and bearing oaks and gums of such stunted habit and unshapely form as to add forlornness to the landscape. In most seasons, the surface was a quagmire, almost impassable to vehicles, and seeming utterly inadequate to bearing the weight of ordinary structures. Apart from its location on the border of the ever-changing but ever-beautiful waters of Lake Michigan, it offered small promise to the casual eye of such a metamorphosis as well-directed taste and skill have wrought upon it. And again, from the history of the World's Fair, we read, "A wonderful metamorphosis. Jackson Park in 1891. An uninviting strip of sand, swamp, and scrub oaks. No redeeming feature except area and location. The most magnificent transformation scene ever presented to mankind. Director of Works Daniel H. Burnham, and his engineers, architects, sculptors, painters, and landscape designers transform a spot of swamp and sand into a white city of palaces and colonnades. Terraces, towers, turrets, and statuary on every hand, plantations of massive foliage and flowering plants, beautiful fountains, and picturesque waterways." This idea that the land chosen for the Columbian Exposition of 1893 was essentially a quagmire, a bog of almost useless sandbars that was miraculously revitalized and crowned with the White City. It was the line, repeated. However, considering the maps we have seen, could there be a different story? Now we begin to set the stage for potentially one of the greatest misdirections in the fair's history. We dive into the report accompanying plan for laying out the South Park by Olmsted himself, proposing the very grounds in which he will again rework for the Columbian Exposition. We read the following notes. Of the other park sites reserved for future benefit of Chicago, but one offers this class of advantages in any degree to compare with that of the South Park, and that, as it should be, is the one which is the greatest distance from it. The two outer divisions of the South Park being connected more directly, however, and by a division considerably wider than any connecting any other two park divisions of the whole series, it is possible to associate them much more intimately in design than any other two, so that each may in many particulars complement the other, and the whole be classed together as one park. If we add to this possibility those which grow out of its situation with reference to the lake, there can be little room for doubt that you have the opportunity, and consequently the duty, of adopting a scale of scenery, and at certain points a scale of public accommodations, larger than can elsewhere be attempted without a restriction upon design with reference to depth and variety of sylvan elements of interest, which would be unfortunate. Before discussing what should be demanded in such a park, and the availability for various required provisions of different parts of your ground, it is necessary that the fact should be recognized that none of the sites, and no part of any one of the sites which have been reserved for parks at Chicago, would generally elsewhere be recognized as well adapted to the purpose. The undertaking involved in the series is, indeed, a bold one, and can be justified only by the conviction that a city of great importance to the world at large, a city which should have a metropolitan character and influence, and to which great numbers of men should be drawn, not only on account of its commercial, but of its scenic, artistic, scholarly, domestic, and social advantages, is here to be built upon ground plans now forming and foundations now laying. It is undeniable that it would be a most serious drawback to such a city not to be provided with parks. It is equally undeniable that when the best has been done that is possible, it will be a long time before parks can be formed for it, which will compare satisfactorily with such as already have been secured by most important cities of the civilized world. It is a courageous forecast, which reasons from these promises that the sooner all that is done, that is possible to be done, for overcoming this disadvantage of the city, is set about, the better. And let's just read this last section here. Its availability for general purposes in which the city as a whole will be interested is considerably greater than that of any other of the sites which have been reserved for parks. It follows that the South Park should belong to a third class, of which the type in London is found in Hyde Park, in Kensington Gardens, and in Paris, in the Bois de Boulogne, a class which should not be a compromise between the two extremes first named, but in which the advantages of each should be completely reconciled and united. So, in discussing the original plans here, how this park is not only the most suitable and can be situated in the most prime of locations for a growing metropolitan city such as Chicago, let's read some other notes here. From The World's Columbian Exposition Illustrated in February 1891, Volume 1, Issue 1. To more definitely describe the location chosen for the exposition, we will say that Jackson Park is located on the lake shore, about 6½ miles south from the courthouse, or center of the business portion of the city. It is one of the city's most attractive places of resort. Here the people, on Sundays and holidays, congregate by the thousands. It is their great breathing place. The ground is level and laid out into winding walks and drives, bordered with trees and flowers, which, with its miniature lakes of glassy surface, form the most beautiful landscape scenes. Bordering it on the east is the gently sloping beach of Lake Michigan. There is no finer view to be had on any inland body of water than there is from this point. This will undoubtedly be the favorite resort of the visitor. When weary of sightseeing, he will find a haven of relief in viewing the beauties of the lake, while he is being fanned by the cool breezes from off its waters. Adjacent to Jackson Park and connected by the Midland Plaisance, a tract of land 600 feet wide, covered with groves of trees, dotted with miniature lakes, is Washington Park, comprising about 600 acres. Here will be placed part of the buildings. The great lawn of 400 acres will be used chiefly for martial parades and displays. The remaining 200 acres is laid out in walks and drives, intercepted with crystal pools, and decorated with flowers and shade trees. This will be a most convenient and desirable breathing space for the heated multitude. Here they can retire from the clamoring crowd and walk in the cool of the shade and breathe the pure air, laden with the perfume of leaves and flowers. We have sections like this coming from the Columbian Exposition and World's Fair Illustrated. Jackson Park, where the greater number of the exposition buildings are, is beautifully situated on the lakeshore, 7 miles southeast of the City Hall, and embraces 586 acres. Washington Park is a mile or more nearer and has 371 acres. Midway Plaisance has 80 acres. Thus, a total of 1,037 acres is available for the exposition. Upon these parks previous to their selection as the World's Fair site, $4 million was spent in laying out the grounds and beautifying them with lawns, flower beds, shrubbery, etc. The exposition people have spent more than $1 million in their further preparation. The contract for grading alone amounted to $397,000. These parks are connected with the center of the city and with the general park and boulevard system by more than 35 miles of boulevards from 100 to 300 feet in width. The improvements include additional walks and driveways, lakes, canals, fountains, statuary, a pier extending 1,500 feet into the lake, etc. In total, these South Parks have had a combined total of $4 million worth of landscaping and beautifying completed, even stating that the exposition people spent only a quarter of the amount to finalize the grounds. We even have a cost and note of the grading that was completed. And would just like to point out the word additional, a key word here, additional walks, driveways, lakes, canals, fountains, statuary, etc. As in, there were already these features here. We even get a similar note in this next section, a few paragraphs later. Additional lawns, terraces, flower beds, rustic seats, walks, drives, and fountains have been constructed. Statuary has been placed at conspicuous points, the lagoon enlarged by sinuous branches, and the lake beach made a charming resort for visitors. So once again, additional elements, not created from scratch or molded from a swamp, a bog, a quagmire, adding to the existing landscape. Let's dive into the Artistic Guide to Chicago and the World's Columbian Exposition, where we can read some notes about these parks. Let's read through the Washington Park first. This park lies between 6 and 7 miles south of the City Hall and extends from 51st to 60th Streets, between Cottage Grove and Kankakee Avenues. It is more than a mile from the lakeshore and contains 371 acres. In many respects, Washington Park may be considered the finest in this system of beautiful surprises. Drexel and Grand Boulevards contribute greatly to its natural beauties. Their entrances to the park are gorgeous panoramas of tempered light, shifting shade and artistic blending of form and color. There are long drives under wide-spreading elms and ancient oaks whose roots were in the soil before the English tongue had been heard this side of the Atlantic. There is the meadow with its 100 acres of velvet sward inviting you to come and bury your flushed face in its fragrant coolness, and a glinting lake covering more than 13 acres, dimpling and sparkling and showing silvery white through careless openings in the green foliage. If Washington Park cannot boast of a long stretch of pebbled shore whereon Lake Michigan dashes in stormy weather and dances in the quiet days, it can boast of one of the most picturesque little lakes in the world, and it is all its own. This park has also a great conservatory, and in-flower plats and foliage painting is far ahead of any of its sisters. A pavilion known as the Retreat, where weary ramblers may be served with refreshments to their liking, stands invitingly near its center. As permits for sports are readily obtained, baseball, archery, lawn tennis, and croquet parties select Washington Park oftener than any other for a day's outing. Both Grand and Drexel Boulevards are traversed by park phaetons, making regular trips to Oakwood Boulevard for passengers. These obliging conveyances are said to carry not less than 100,000 passengers during the year. The stable in which the park phaetons are kept is one of the attractions of the park. It is 325 by 200 feet and accommodates 100 horses. The portion allotted to the horses is unique and interesting. It is circular in form, and the stalls are ranged in 2 consecutive rings with an alley between. The horses used to draw the phaetons are all greys and resemble each other very much in form and deportment. If you take a park phaeton, you may be driven through these stables. Let's read a couple sections from Jackson Park, too. There is much beautiful scenery in Jackson Park, of the wild and picturesque kind. The woods are of native trees, and the lakes, which form a sinuous chain throughout the park, were, many of them, the result of the broken and undulating nature of the ground before it came under the cultivating hand of man. The shore along the lake at this point is high and the ground solid. The work which is to be done on these grounds during the next 2 years will entirely change the topography of the place, but the opportunity will present itself to make Jackson Park, at the close of the exposition, the grandest park in the city, if not the world. Also, there is this line, which could be interpreted in multiple ways. It reads, 8 miles to the southeast of the City Hall, along the shore of Lake Michigan, lies Jackson Park, memorable now from having been selected as the site of the world's Columbian Exposition. It contains altogether 593 acres, only 84 of which were improved before work was begun on the World's Fair grounds. So, only 84 acres out of the total 593 were improved before work was begun on the grounds. Now, this could simply indicate that the areas which have been shown, these parks and plans from Olmsted, only 84 acres were actually landscaped. Or, ponder the following. Considering what we have read through, what you have seen and what has been presented in regards to the parks before the exposition, that this area was not described accurately, that these areas were indeed a beautiful, intricately laid out park system prior to the exposition. Not just any old parks though, it was the park for Chicago, its premier space of greenery, its crowning jewel that was on par with other worldly parks, an international contender, a spot where thousands would congregate on a single weekend day or holidays. It was not 600 acres that needed to be completely built up from scratch. It was merely 84 that were required to be improved, equivalent to 14%. Only 14% was required to be improved to allow for the building and the groundwork to commence. An area, a park, which was already renovated to the tune of $4 million, designed and developed by the same gentleman who was renowned with creating exceptional landscaped areas, and was then in charge of revamping the same grounds for the Columbian Exposition. Was this a misdirection of the many publications surrounding the event? If so, you may ask why. Why would they make such grand and exaggerated claims about the grounds beforehand? And that there is the question, isn't it? Why? Because there is no story without it. There is no grand dilemma. There is no uncertainty. There's no challenge to overcome of the great city of Chicago and its denizens. If the grounds had already been worked to a point where the modifications were actually quite minor in the grand scheme of things, what kind of introduction does that serve? This was the purpose of the Department of Publicity and Promotion, explored heavily in Episode 8. It was meant to drown out opposing views and prop up Chicago on a pedestal, a city that could conquer any obstacle, real or potentially manufactured. What kind of story would it have been to say, well, the grounds for the exposition were already largely in place and were designed by legendary landscape architect Frederick Olmsted, and we really didn't need to do much in order to prepare the grounds. Just add some additional pathways, driveways, fountains, maybe some canals and a few other bibs and bobs. As with artistic contrast of even the most basic black and white colors, this is contrast of storytelling. A woefully unprepared quagmire, a landscape canvas of irredeemable quality, was transformed into the beautiful white city. This is the great reveal, the grand metamorphosis that visitors and interested parties would read about for years to come, even to this very date. Even I thought this was an incredible undertaking. The idea that roughly 600 acres had to be prepared, excavated, and even compacted for these structures. Yet these documents may lead to a different story of how this area had already been prepared, landscaped, and was Chicago's premier park of the time. Additionally, just to note, another document which was read in the last presentation discussing the piles and foundation of material at the site from the Engineering magazine in 1891, we read, "The sand found at the site may be considered as practically incompressible, except in a few instances where piles are used." And so just going back to the last episode here briefly, the 20,000 piles experiment with AI. It was probably substantially less, considering the grounds may have been prepared decades beforehand, and the sandy areas which were also used were largely solid and incompressible, except in a few instances. Then piles were used. And so, what is the story? Is it either or? Maybe something in between what has been presented? Does this explain the bricked areas, the construction, the groundwork? I can't really say for sure. Does this create almost a strange Royal Fork type instance though? Should we believe that this supposed area used for the Columbian Exposition was indeed a miserable swamp and bog? It was indeed a miraculous transformation. This is indeed the marketing campaign and mainstream viewpoint. It is what has been repeated and regurgitated, not only by the souvenir books and publications, but by those looking to discredit the event. How could they have possibly prepared 600 acres for this event in the time frame given? Or do we fall into this other side, where maybe this grand metamorphosis was manufactured to sell copies, to sell to the visitors and tourists, to sell a story, the story? Is this story of the exposition grounds one of them? World-renowned park or irredeemable wasteland? Suppose that's one for you to decide. Now on to the next section. I've collected a slew of plans, technical drawings, and blueprints to go through. All of these will be linked below so they can be viewed and investigated. We will start with the collections on the Ryerson and Burnham archives. The first set is in relation to the site development, and then we will move on to the Palace of Fine Arts. As these architectural drawings are presented, you may notice that the quality is quite unclear. It's unfortunate. This is due to these materials being on microfilm, which is a type of storage in order to preserve vast amounts of data and documents. So these images are quite small, and are essentially images of images of images, if that makes sense. We can see that there are similar mappings to what was shown with Olmsted, and we will get to his work momentarily, which is presented in much higher resolution. Now, into a larger file here, which is the Palace of Fine Arts. These are of the same quality, and are on the same archive. There are a few other buildings on there, and we'll leave those for you to discover. Looking at the vast amount of sheets in relation to this building is incredible. Every angle and detail appears to be accounted for, yet it is truly hard to decipher just because of the quality. Regardless, there is enough to indicate the main aspects and details of the building. So let's move on to Olmsted's archive. Here we will dive back into the plans and blueprints of the grounds. So here we have a selection of plans which have multiple iterations. This is exactly what we would expect with this type of design work. Ideation and creative development. Iteration. Multiple designs to try and flesh out a finalized plan of how the grounds would be developed and presented. So maybe I'll put a map of the finished grounds on the screen so we can compare and contrast as these images scroll by. So we can see with this first one, these are topographic maps. Again, completely gridded out with elevation data and specific elevation of water features or elements. These are maps, these are plans, these are blueprints for creating the grounds. So let's get into some details here. So we can see that the pier and peristyle is different, hardly mapped out even. The large canal section running south is completely gone due to the large machinery building. No agriculture building here either. We can see the administration building it's gone, and included with it is this depot building. More square, no real shape at all. The two buildings here, which would probably be the mines and electrical building, are actually oriented the opposite way. The wooded aisle is different, the government building is slimmer, the fisheries building is completely different, along with the horticultural building. We have no Palace of Fine Arts, no state buildings, no foreign government buildings, no music hall. This is clearly an iteration. Here we can see the main basin in more detail. The manufacturer's building actually portrays two large open-air sections. The mines and electrical building are reoriented. The rail lines are in this unique circular pattern, with the depot and administration building having a bit more character and design in this one. Still no canal to the south, but more in line with the final design. The horticultural building is more refined, along with the women's building and transportation building. Look at the wooded aisle compared to the last iteration, and our government building has been shifted, made more square. Fisheries has become more square as well. And just scrolling through the rest of these, we have pencil sketches that show the same type of differentiating details, design, and development. Feel free to pause the video and compare the rest of these ground plans, the differences and the similarities which lead to the final design. Next is the World's Columbian Exposition plan showing proposed finished grades. So just scrolling through these documents here, the entire complex is present with the grade calculation present for every required detail. An interesting look into the development process. Here we have some plans and blueprints showing the layout of the canal system or main court. This includes a plan for the canal walls, giving dimensions, and grades of said details. Here we have a plan of the electrical building. Here is an iterative sketch showing the fisheries building, which is certainly more accurate to the finalized version. The Illinois State Building is still being reworked for final position, along with the canal system being represented in red pen or marker. Here is a blueprint, and it's the World's Columbian Exposition sketch, showing location for buildings to be erected by foreign governments as determined on or before January 13th, 1892. So we have a layout here with some measurements showcasing the plots for each building, these also being signed by the director and chief of construction. Just some cool little details there. This is the actual survey of the site for the French building. Again, measurements included, even details of the trees and type of tree. However, it does not appear that the trees on this specific blueprint are labeled. Next are the plans of walks in vicinity of building for horticulture, showing the design and layout for the entire area. There was also this interesting sketch of the interior of the horticultural layout, or the walks and plant display within the building. Moving along to some maps and plans of the wooded island here, showing locations of trees, walks, and area to be selected by the horticultural department for floral exhibits. Again, gridded out, and showing details described. A few other sketches here too, showing the surrounding buildings and how they will be portrayed in their final iteration. Here we have the Midway Place Sans, which may have been part of some of the original grounds maps we were looking at earlier. Again, though, completely gridded out and measured for preparation. Something interesting to note is that this would have been completed before the event of 1893. And are there differences between this mapping and the proposed grounds by Olmsted in 1871 for the redevelopment of the South Parks? Just some intriguing details to keep in mind. A blueprint here of the monastery of La Rabida, showing rough details of the surrounding areas and more intricate details of the building itself. Some sketches and blueprints of the northern section of the grounds, specifically showing subdivisions thereof, within each of which a place may be assigned for a state or foreign government building, or other special object for which space cannot, under the official classification, be provided with any of the main exposition buildings. Here is a plan showing arrangement of walks on terraces bordering the main basin, another showing the preliminary plan of courts. Next is a couple of topographic maps showing Washington Park being gridded out and prepared for the exposition. We even have an iteration that shows some of the main buildings in Jackson Park being laid out in Washington Park. Just incredible details and view into the process of creating the grounds. Now here is an interesting one. Here is a map of Jackson Park showing proposed water supply system for the exposition, even seeing that the buildings are from an earlier iteration. So we have a plan showcasing water distribution. We even have a similar one showing proposed sewerage systems for the exposition. Looks like it is using a similar layout of the buildings as the one previous. There are more that have not been shown within this archive, yet this is just an example of how there certainly are plans, maps, and blueprints of these details. Let's move on to another publication which illustrated the insurance map for the exposition. As the images scroll by, I'll put up the legend or key in the corner so we can decipher elements portrayed. They include color coding buildings by material, frame, brick, staff covered, showing hydrant locations inside buildings and out, showing indicators for standpipes and water pipes, showing one-story and gallery indicators, height measurements of buildings and building features, indicators for roof styles, shingle, slate, or metal, composition or gravel. It indicates elevated railways and surface railways. It shows locations for fire alarm boxes, along with walking paths and corresponding measurements. Yet another detailed document of infrastructure on the grounds. And a note here. This may be its own video in time, yet the main point here is that not everything is digitized. Images, diaries, blueprints, documents of every sort. I truly believe this is another aspect which is poorly misunderstood. The vast amount of documents which are in libraries and archives that are not digitized or are waiting to be digitized. Collections that are only available by request, in person at libraries, archives, and universities. It's almost as if people think that as soon as the internet sprung about, everything was available. The process of not only sourcing, but handling and actually digitizing documents is work. It takes time and people to do this work. For example, here's a reference in regards to the official photographer, Charles Dudley Arnold, where this portfolio, 9 boxes and 17 oversized portfolios, contain nearly 1,200 large format photographic prints. 1,200 available in person by request. That's one collection on one archival site. Or a massive collection of Chicago Park District records from 1870 to 2014, which would be a great asset of my earlier segment. 106,000 drawings. Now yes, it does go to 2014, but also the materials are stored off-site, and advance notice is required for use, having to request this 24 hours in advance. Additionally, this small article from the Chicago Public Library, showing images and describing one of the oldest in the Chicago Park District collection. They are plans for Jackson Park on Chicago's south side, later becoming the Exposition site. This being a general plan being completed in 1885. Luckily, we do have some images to view, yet it is documents like this that are so incredibly fragile and are required to be handled with such care. It would be difficult to digitize even this single fragment. It requires time, patience, expertise, and it's not just a matter of, oh, here it is, let's upload it. Even the oils from bare hands could cause irreparable damage to some of these documents. You can see from the Chicago Public Library the host of items that are only available within the library itself. This is where the paraphernalia is, the papers, the journals, the newspaper cutouts, the diaries. This type of stuff has always been available. It just needs to be investigated personally, or is on the docket to be digitized. Unless those claiming all these materials don't exist have gone to the lengths of investigating libraries in person, these words are hollow. Talk is cheap, they say. And so to move on from this point back into blueprints and maps and plans, let's not forget about the French Technical Review. The visual atlases are still being published on the channel. Explored this briefly in episode 12. This was completed largely by Camille Krantz, a French representative who was also trained at École Polytechnique, or trained in polytechnics. What does this mean? The education at École Polytechnique would have been characterized by a strong emphasis on mathematics, physics, and engineering. Rigorous academic standards for training both civilian engineers and officers for the armed forces of France. Therefore, the man responsible for this technical review was a polytechnic engineer. The first atlas of this set shows copious amounts of measurements for every aspect of the structures, measurements down to the millimeter, illustrated and written, documented to the finest minutiae of details. They show innumerable measurements. They show the material in incredible detail. and any competent engineer could compute data externally from these schematics. This would include loads. These are some of the mysterious and supposedly non-existent engineering drawings or plans. This work was specifically intended to be useful for engineers, architects, and industrialists. The data presented and gathered was described as follows. To this end, we have been keen to collect, either directly or through collaborators, combining recognized and competence with indisputable authority, not only the information that could be found at the exhibition, but also that which it was necessary to obtain from the factories themselves to complete. The factories themselves, obtaining information regarding the technical aspects in regards to engineering, architecture, and industry from the factories themselves. Speaking of factories, let's dive into another section of this technical review, discussing American manufacturers and how they use graphic statics. For those unfamiliar, in simple terms, it allows designers to visualize how forces are distributed within a structure, and how the shape of the structure affects those forces. It involves the use of graphical methods to study forces in equilibrium, with a focus on the relationship between a structure's geometry and the equilibrium of its internal forces. So with that bit of information, let's see what this section in the mines and mining building states. American manufacturers, in fact, use graphic statics a lot to determine the extension or compression of forces that act in the members and trusses that make up their large metal constructions. After having determined these forces by this graphic process, they deduce the dimensions of the parts by applying the formulas for the resistance of materials. This atlas is on the channel. It is available to view and inspect yourself. The next and final detail for the technical review section here was mentioned in episode 12, and we'll state it again to reinforce this idea even further. The Chicago Exposition is a rich mine to be exploited. Information of all kinds abounds there. We have proposed to collect that which relates to new principles, to new application of known principles, to the most recent and most ingenious modes of construction, manufacture, and exploitation, to the processes allowing to realize a greater economy and a greater perfection in the work. The role of Camille Krantz and his countrymen was to document every possible detail of any aspect relating to engineering, architecture, and industry, as it was a rich mine to be exploited. So we're going to shift into our final section here. We have seen the idea that maybe the park system that was chosen for the Columbian Exposition site may have already been a thriving and beautiful park space for the last decade or so prior to the event itself. Not just any park, Chicago's premier park, completed by the same man, Frederick Law Olmsted, who was chosen again for the development of the exposition grounds. Jumping back into the biography here, which we referenced in the initial parts of this episode, let's read how the exposition director, Daniel Burnham, regarding Olmsted at a dinner honoring the contribution of artists for this grand event. We read, "A guest of honor at the dinner given to D.H. Burnham and other artists of the world's Columbian Exposition by fellow architects in the city of New York. During the speaking, Charles Eliot Norton said, 'Of all American artists, Frederick Law Olmsted, who gave the design for the laying out of the grounds of the World's Fair, stands first in the production of great works which will answer the needs and give expression to the life of our immense and miscellaneous democracy.' Mr. Burnham said, 'Each of you knows the name and genius of him who stands first in the heart and confidence of American artists, the creator of your own parks and many other city parks. He it is who has been our best advisor and common mentor. In the highest sense, he is the planner of the exposition, Frederick Law Olmsted. No word of his has fallen to the ground among us since first he joined us some 30 months ago. An artist, he paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. He should stand where I do tonight, not for his deeds of later years alone, but for what his brain has wrought and his pen has taught for half a century. Not just a contributor, but a planner. The planner of the exposition. A true artist, and actually a really beauty of a line here, that he paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. Frederick Law Olmsted was considered the planner of the exposition, and we have substantial amount of material in archives to substantiate this claim, viewing some of it earlier in this very episode. So this final report that we will read, it appears to be the entire process and will certainly mirror what has been presented in souvenir books and official accounts of what the landscape looked like. Even in the technical review mentioned earlier, we have these sections here that state, this land belonged to the South Park Commission, which had acquired it 20 years previously with a view to transforming it into a public park. In reality, it was still fallow, as we have already said, with the exception of a strip of land at its northern end, which had been leveled, planted, transformed by ponds and made accessible by means of avenues and walks. In truth, the appearance of this uncultivated desert presented many obstacles to the realization of the horticultural splendors of the parks and gardens, which had characterized the previous international exhibitions. The imagination of landscape architects, however, perceived the possibility of drawing from these unattractive elements quite extraordinary effects of an entire appropriate character. Ultimately, this is up for you to decide. I'm merely bringing the data to assess and analyze, and I truly believe that there is a silent majority that watches these videos, genuinely curious, simply wanting to know if there are blueprints. Are these claims actually true? Or interesting threads, such as the park segment earlier. Whether people believe them is an entirely different story. Yet these videos are for those with the ability to take in all sides and evaluate the validity. There will always be loud minorities on either side screaming that there is no X, Y, or Z. They don't exist until someone brings them forth. There are plans, there are blueprints, technical drawings, and even utility plans mapping out infrastructure. I can't claim to have found them all, yet there is enough here to dispel any questions about their existence. It's not hidden, it's not difficult to find, yet these slogan-type talking points continue. So again, does this create a strange element, this royal fork? Will we see the rush to reinforce the story that this land was indeed a swamp, that it was indeed a quagmire, rushing to reinforce the mainstream narrative in order to hold up the unbelievable story? Or are you willing to consider an alternative? Did they exaggerate, mislead, or even lie to sell a story? For without this aspect, there is no triumphant rise over unparalleled obstacles. There is no hero's journey for the great city of Chicago to tell her exposition tale.